with Mariann. Mariann's book is absolutely wonderful. Show of hands on who's read it yet. Wonderful. And hopefully others will as well. It's about courage. And one of the things I'd love her to start with, and I'll ask each of the bishops to start with just a little bit of grounding today, but I asked Mariann to start with why courage. And one of the things that struck me in this book is when we think of courage, we often think of it in this very muscular form of people standing up heroically with every word coming out in complete sentences, saying what needs to be said. This was a much more complex look at courage, much as I think she navigated us through how we looked at our faith in a very complex living way. So I wonder, Bishop, I wonder if you would be kind enough to just start by, why did you write about courage, and how would you define courage?
Thank you, RT, and thanks to all of you. Well, first of all, the subtitle was actually my working title for all of the book. In fact, it was my intended title, Decisive Moments in Life and Faith, How We Learn to Be Brave. And it was the editors who flipped it, which was fine. But I was really wanting to delve in. I was given the opportunity. I was invited to write a book, which was a real honor, and I was asked what I would want to write about. And this was on the heels, as you might imagine, of my sort of one moment of Andy Warhol type fame, when there was a fairly widespread assumption that I had done something terribly brave. And I'm not discounting the whatever it takes to call something out that seems wrong at the time. But I wanted to expand the notion of what it means to be a brave person. Because in that particular moment, I didn't feel especially brave. I felt I was acting more out of the kind of impulse that you have when you just are confronted with something and need to deal with it, right? I wanted to spend more time thinking about those moments when we know we are making a decision and it's significant. It may not be significant to anyone other than us, the one making it, but we know as we're stepping into it, we are making a decision, and it's those moments that mark us. These are the stories that we hang when people ask us about our lives, we hang our life story on. Sometimes they're very out there. People know that we're making them, but some of the most courageous things we do are no one sees or don't realize that they're witnessing something that will set the course of our life for years to come. So I was given a chance to be expansive, and also how we learn these things. And we learn in the doing, and we learn in the failing and getting up again when we fail. We learn in those long stretches when nothing seems to be happening, but in retrospect we realize that we're given an opportunity to prepare for something that we don't even know is coming yet. So I guess that's why it may seem different, because it's more on those moments that teach us what it looks like to be brave.
So Bishop 2, how do I do this with Bishop?
You could just use Craig too.
And Mariann, I think that would...
I could do that.
Yes.
Okay.
One of the things I love about coming back to Minnesota is that people don't call me Bishop. So
okay, right.
Really appreciate it if you didn't do
okay.
If they didn't tell me, I would lose my first name,
So it was really great, Craig, and I think one of the things that it's a really helpful pivot on is there's this chapter in Mariann's book, but it's really a through line about stepping up. And don't expect to pick up a book about people who have halos over their head, really ordinary people, but one of them and I wrote down their quote, "You were with a member of this congregation as they were dying, and he said to you, 'You can go now,' sending you off to D.C., but said, 'I'm going to die. like everything we say in church is true. And I just loved that quote. And it was really sort of this interesting way of illustrating so many stories in the book about people who tried to live up to what we are supposed to be. Could you take us back to that moment and how you connect that to other forms of bravery, about how there's this aspirational thing we want to be, and we don't all get there? How do you really help those of us who find ourselves falling short and don't know whether we can step up? Just a small little question, Mariann. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, there's
I could have made that easier.
There's a lot there, IT. First of all, it was Rod Hardy, by the way, Katie Hardy's husband. And the summer that Paul and I were making our transition from here to Washington was when Rod was dying. And he knew he was dying. And there was this moment when Paul and I knew that we needed to go and say goodbye to Rod and Katie, but we also knew it would be saying goodbye on this side of the Jordan. And as I wrote in the book, and as you described so well, he was just so happy for me. You know, he was just so excited for me. But the thing that really just stayed with me from the time I left his room was, you just watch me now. Watch me. I'm going to die as if everything we say in church is true. And I think that's a faith statement as well as a statement, well, maybe they're the same thing, intentionality and faith. The stepping up part is a little different in that, I mean, as you said, it's a through line, but it also describes those moments when life comes at us quickly and we don't have time to think. We only have time to respond. And in those moments, what we have to draw upon is everything that we've got or that the Spirit can give us in that moment. The likelihood that we're going to get it right is pretty low, actually, because there's just so many unpredictable forces in play. But what's not in question is the fact that we have to do it. Right? It's not, so whether or not we get it right or wrong, whatever those categories mean, is irrelevant. What matters is that we step. And that's why it was a baseball image that came to me. It came to me during one of the worst seasons in COVID when we were no vaccines yet. We were all still walking around like we were all going to die. And I was just on the receiving end of an inordinate amount of requests for help. Some of them were really small. Some of them were really significant. And I'm not even sure the people who were asking them of me had any idea what they were asking, right? But at the time, I realized, look, I'm healthy. I'm not a first responder. I've got a roof over my head. All of my family is okay. And I just got this sense, it is just your turn to step up. So just say yes. Every time something comes, just say yes. Because there isn't a person in the world who is not exhausted right now and scared and doing the best they can. So if you can do it, just do it. And I know my teachers used to say, when you're dancing with a gorilla, you don't stop when you're tired, right? It just, it's just like we were all exhausted. So like people say, how are you doing? Well, I'm tired. Well, right, who isn't tired? Go do your job. So that was one aspect. But the others, and the chapters are pretty clear, deciding to go, deciding to stay, deciding to start something that's going to take years to accomplish, and it's not a sure bet, right? But still at that moment that you need to start, right? Deciding to accept something that you would have given anything to avoid, but you can't avoid it, so you can either fight against it or you can accept it and learn what it has to teach you and go about it with as much grace as you can. Deciding to step up when those moments come. And then on the other side of all of that, I also wanted to describe, because I don't think we talk about it enough, which is the inevitable feeling of letdown that happens after times of big drama, right? When we've got adrenaline and when everything is, we're just, and then there's the aftermath, which maybe was your moment when you just think, I've just made the biggest mistake in my life, or worse, do I need to go in search of the next big moment, right? Is the only thing that matters. Am I most alive only when all of those synapses are in play? Or is there something to be learned about the emptiness that follows and what it means to live in emptiness after a big deal, right? And then in the end, finally, perseverance, which is a way of acknowledging that those big moments are relatively rare. And what really matters is our alignment, how we choose to live, having experienced what we experienced. So I heard Rod Hardy say, I'm going to die as if everything we say in church is true. Well, okay, then, how am I going to live as if everything we say in church is true? Right? That's a different question. And maybe not as dramatic, but equally important. So
Let me follow that with a question for both of you, and starting with you, Craig. We are talking about bravery, we're talking about courage, but we're in a church and we're sitting here with two bishops. Put faith into this within the context of something that was quite surprising to me as somebody who's sat in these pews and heard Mariann and never seen a moment of self-doubt that I could see. And never. She knows what she's doing. I'll do whatever the heck she says, And yet I read in the book.
This is an example of selective memory.
This is true.
I'm used to it. That's okay. Good.
So I'm reading in the book, and I was sort of shocked by this thing, that there are times when you stood up and didn't fully know what you were going to say, and Jesus filled in. I didn't put that as well as you put it. You can correct it when I come. But this issue of how do you uniquely, as faith leaders, see this? You're not just an author. You're both bishops. Where does faith fit into this? How does God act through you at this moment?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think what I would want to say is that, and I'd be interested to know what Mariann's take on this is, for me as a follower of Jesus, courage is never something I generate. It's never something that I manufacture because I'm, brave enough or good enough or faithful enough. I think, in the story that I told, what was terrifying and painful for me is that I was put in a circumstance that I did not choose through COVID, George Floyd's murder, all of these circumstances that converged when I started. And it made me so that I imagined myself to be helpless, which of course is true. It's just that a lot of times I have enough tricks that can trick me into thinking I'm not helpless, right? Because they work okay. But actually, faith means remembering I'm not actually good enough to do it. I'm not actually competent. I'm not actually brave enough. Right. But it's about stepping up and showing up and putting yourself in the hands of God. I was telling RT and Mariann beforehand, and some of you were at convention and heard me say this at convention, that my wife and I took our kids to Harry Potter World a month ago. And my kids are not big roller coaster people, we've discovered. And, but that's the thing. And so there was a lot of waiting in lines, and the anxiety in my children would build as they were waiting in line to get on these pretty benign roller coasters. And so we had a mantra that we said, here's the thing about life, kids. You got to do it scared. And when you do something scared, you'll find that it is actually exhilarating and joyful and fun. And I think that's how faith works.
Great, thank you.
I'm not, nothing that would take away a bit of what you said. I would maybe expand the lens a little bit to say, for me in faith, It comes in a lot of different, faith plays through all of it. There is the inspirational side of faith, which is when you really feel inspired and energized and excited to do something. And in fact, it is something you can do. You know, you were made for this. Like, it was a part of the giftedness that God has given you. And you feel the joy of it. You feel the empowerment. You feel the creative impulses or the intelligence. All the things that make us human and more than human when we tap into that creative energy. And that's not a Christian thing. That's not a Jewish thing. That's a human thing, right? That's just part of the way we were made. And I think that's a really important experience of faith. And then there are those times, many times, when we sense, and I would say that the call feels like it's coming like a summons. I use that word a fair amount in the book. It feels like I'm being summoned to do something, large or small. Whether it's in my wheelhouse or not, whether I feel like doing it or not, those are not the categories that are important. It's just, here it is, and it's calling you. And in the times when I don't feel adequate, any number of things can happen. One is the great loaves and fishes miracle, right? You offer what you have, like the little boy in the disciples' story or the disciples themselves. There's a whole bunch of people that need to be fed. All they've got is a few loaves and some fish, and they offer it up. And through the miracle of grace, the offering is sufficient. And I think all of us could point to a time when that happened, right? We knew it wasn't enough, but something happened through the economy of grace and the miracle of other people and what's beyond us, and it's enough. So that's pretty wonderful. And I tell you, I live my life in that story, and for preachers, I think it's a weekly event, right? I just think it is, right? I just think it is. But the other thing can also happen is that you don't have enough and you make your offering, and guess what? The miracle doesn't happen. And you fall flat on your face, or you make just a terrible mistake, or it's totally inadequate. And I feel terrible afterwards. Like, no, that wasn't good enough. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about mistakes, talking about failure, talking about the artistic process that requires you to have a vision of what could be, what you could offer, and it not being very good at first. And that's part of the learning, part of the process is going through that really not much fun period of trying, failing, or not making it, and then one day. So that I think the Spirit is involved in that too, right? And then there's one other one. I think this is my favorite, and I use the story of Jacob in the Bible to describe it. I won't go into it in detail here, but maybe you've had this experience where, and I reference a story when we had just come back from time in Minnesota, right? Time with our kids, time with all of you, and it was still in the pandemic, and I didn't know when I was going to see my kids or my grandkids again. I had no idea, and I'm glad I'm the bishop of the Diocese of Washington, but I wasn't glad then, and I would have given anything not to be. And I just found myself going down this delicious spiral of depression, right? And I was enjoying like every second. I was just willing. I mean, I was just sinking down, and I was wallowing in this. I am just sad. I'm sad. And our neighbor, who is this amazing one-woman organizer, was putting together what she called the yard giveaway for undocumented workers in Washington, D.C. who don't benefit from benefited from none of the programs that kept poor people alive during COVID. She was organizing this big thing, and long story short, I didn't feel like going to that at all. I didn't feel like doing anything. But I gathered up some stuff from my house. I went to the giveaway, And I was lifted out of myself by the joy of that experience and the exuberance of the kids running around. And I just felt like God had sort of plucked me from my depression, stuck me over here and said, would you please stop thinking of yourself right now and think about this instead. Look at these people. Look at these. Just go do those things. And all of my sadness was waiting for me when I got done, right? I was still me with all my contradictions and imperfections, but for a few hours, I got to do this amazing thing. And that felt like grace. So I think it can be any of those things, RT. It can be, and more besides.
You know, I had one of those moments of grace in this church with you, and I was sitting about there, and in an hour, I was mayor at the time, and in an hour I was going to go to Shiloh Temple in North Minneapolis and speak at the funeral of a child who'd been shaken to death. And I was supposed to stand up as this white guy in a black church who somehow was supposed to say something.
Right.
And I was terrified as I was sitting there. And you preached something to the effect that we are not marionettes being directed by God. These opportunities are open to us. And it began to get me thinking more and more about how did God do that? And I still was terrified as I went to the church, but when I stood up there, and I attribute this to you, Andrew, that spirit, the words that came out of my mouth were, God did not shake this child. The hand of God holds us in this moment. That's not anything that ever would come out of my mouth before. I felt this huge wave back to the church. You lifted me. I gave them a language to talk to each other about a hideous moment. And whatever that is, I think there are many ways on that. I'm going to ask you one more quick question with each of you and ask Mariann to read something. And then you all look very comfortable, but I'm going to ask you to ask questions here. So just the quick question, the book near the end, the chapter is about basically Lent. You touched on that just a second ago. This moment of self-doubt. I want you to think about Lent to Easter. You know, I've sat in this church with everything draped and so sad, and you're kneeling for 3 hours, and you're really bummed out. And then all of a sudden, the Easter lilies smell great, and it's Easter Sunday, okay? Can you, I don't know, it's just the stuff's coming out of my mouth, it's moving to me. So anyways, can you help us think of sort of like a Lent to Easter moment? Does that trip anything for you? Like where the self-doubt changed into?
Well, I'll start. And this is, I think, for me, and I start a chapter with it. For me, the amazing thing about the journey from Lent to Easter in Jesus' life is this decisive moment for him that we could almost miss. In fact, we could read the Gospels all of our lives and miss this moment. When Jesus is in Galilee, which has been his home base, where he's got a following, he's got this great thing going, people are flocking to hear him. He goes up a mountain and he has this experience that signals to him that his life is not, he's not long for this world. And surrounded by the prophets, and it's this mystical thing. He comes down from the mountain. Everything is waiting for him just as before. And in that moment, the Gospel of Luke says, and Jesus turned his face toward Jerusalem. And the rest of the Gospel from that until the moments of Holy Week are him walking toward that destiny. Yeah. And what's so striking about it is that as he's going, all these cool things are happening. In fact, as you're reading the story, you kind of forget that he's got this destiny, like he's walking toward Jerusalem. No, he's having dinner with Mary and Martha, and he's healing this really, he's just having, but he's walking toward his destiny, and his destiny is the cross. And so I think on some level, we all have those moments when the way of life is the way of the cross, but the way of the cross is through suffering and loss and letting go. And there's nothing about that that's easy. There's nothing about that that's Easter lilies. And in fact, the whole experience of Lent, Holy Week, and Easter is to help us get through those moments when there's not going to be a happy ending. But what Jesus and God promises is that whatever happens that is terrible is in the realm of God, not the end of the story. Although it may be the end of part of our story, and that death isn't something that is ever minimized in the eyes of God. So if you came away with the message that it's, turn on a light switch and it's Easter, which is, a perfectly understandable response for somebody who doesn't come to all of the services. So
I was so busy at home praying, I couldn't get to church. Yes.
And I'm just kidding, because the services aren't the point, right? The services aren't the point. The point is when we're in those moments ourselves, because Lent can happen anytime, right? Holy Week can happen tomorrow. Yeah. It's like, what does God have to say to us when we're there? And one of the things God says to us is, yeah, I know. Yeah. I know.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add. I'm still stuck on the idea that St. John's in Minneapolis kneels for 3 hours.
She said that to me at the cathedral, so.
I didn't know that, Lisa. I'm not sure I can add much to what Mariann said, but what I will say is that I think for me, the difference between Christian hope, which is something the world desperately longs for, and a sort of naive wish that everything's going to turn out okay, which is what we often see. The difference between those two things is our willingness to be honest about embracing loss. That if it's only when we embrace loss that we really understand what hope means in a meaningful way. So in the story that I started out with, where I am today in this moment, my heart is absolutely full in where I am and where God has put me and what I'm doing. But I had to be willing to go through the really painful and excruciating experience of losing what I thought I wanted in order to arrive at the moment that I happen to be in now. And I think that's the Lent, the difference between hope and naive wishful thinking is our ability to embrace Lent, and to see every transformation, every hope, every way that God renews life will involve and require me to lose something.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
These guys are great. By the way, just on the 3-hour kneeling, it's my mother's line, not me. She used to say on Good Friday, if Christ can hang on the cross, you can kneel for 3 hours.
So good. It's my next Good Friday sermon.
Okay,
honestly.
so my sister and my wife have heard it too many times. Okay, so we're going to ask you to ask questions after Mariann. We're going to have a real gift. She's going to read from the book for us.
This is in the chapter Deciding to Start. Each decision to start a courageous journey is unique, yet the experience is universal. When, for example, does a child decide to walk or to speak? The first stirrings are instinctive and unconscious. Still, there is agency in her decision to pull herself up and take her first steps toward her mother's outstretched arms. As she grows, choice takes on an increasingly larger role, such as when learning to ride a bicycle or play a musical instrument. Then we see even more clearly the courage required in a young person's decision to start, the risk and vulnerability of stepping beyond her current capacity to learn something new, and her excitement at accomplishing what was once impossible. Humans are not the only species with the capacity to begin journeys of consequence. My bird-watching husband tells me of certain species that make migratory treks from one end of a continent to another. How do birds know when to start? What keeps them on course when they've not made the journey before? Where humans differ, it seems, is in our capacity to envision possibilities beyond our sight and move toward them. It isn't instinct alone that propels us. A spiritual beckoning draws us toward a destiny. But the choice is ours to make, even as we feel summoned by a presence or an energy not our own. When we make that decision, the path ahead may be clear, as in a course of study or vocational accreditation. But others are ambiguous, more akin to driving at night in the fog, which is how the novelist D.L. Doctorow described the process of writing. Writing. You can only see as far as your headlights, he said, but you can make the whole trip that way. In either case, what lies beyond the horizon can only be realized by moving toward it.
I know we're not supposed to have money changers in the temple, but buy this book. It's awesome. Okay, your turn. How do we want to do this? I know you gave me instructions that I didn't pay enough attention to. So we're going to circulate with mics. Okay, hands up. Here we go.
Steve, why don't you stand up?
Thanks. Pivoting off of Bishop Craig's comment about embracing loss, what I'm remembering about the two of you is 2007 when the bridge collapsed. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you drew courage out of each other, because you seemed to work together so seamlessly during that time of heartbreaking loss.
Wow. Do you want to start? I got it. No, all right.
Well, I'll start with it, because my part of this is very, very small. And I remember we were in the process of searching for a new musician for the church when this happened. And I remember it was Kurt Morrow who was on he was in high school, and he came into the library and said, 35W Bridge just collapsed. It was a day in August, right?
Yeah.
And so I would just say that my part was very small in that RT at one point, there were a few sort of impromptu services that were organized in the first couple of days, and then RT called me and said, we need to organize a big service. We need to have the families there. We need to just do it big. And he said, can you handle it? And I said, yes. And what I learned in that moment is that just like bridges that aren't supposed to fall down, relationships across a community, when you need them isn't when you can build them, right? And we had a really strong network of interfaith leaders and people who, whenever I and there were two others of us, it wasn't just me, we just made the phone call and said, can we use St. Mark's Cathedral? Yes. Can you help us do this? Yes. Can you do this? Yes. And within a matter of days, we had a service. And I remember the families coming, and I remember you and the governor speaking, I mean, all of that. But it was the economy of the community and the relationships that were in place, which just reminded me, work on those relationships all the time. Don't expect them to be there for you when you need them if you're not going to do the work now, which is, by the way, a big message for us now when we're trying to stay in relationship with our Christian, Jewish, and Muslim friends in the moment that we're in, right? We need those relationships all the time. So but RT's role was much, much bigger.
Well, people, when I finished being mayor, I was thinking about who my best partners were. And strangely, I realized my best partners were actually a coalition of interfaith spiritual leaders in the city. There were about 6, 7, 8, they'd alternate. But from the very beginning, Mariann was the centerpiece of that. I asked her to organize an interfaith service when I became mayor. when we did everything from homelessness to everything else. We kept bringing this group together. I think a group of you went to Israel together. Were you in that
I
group?
didn't go, but a group did, yeah.
But they were really tight, and so I was calling on them constantly. But what was really important is that along with that, and Mariann kept uniting all of these faith leaders in a huge way. It was an ongoing thing, and I called on that often. But on a personal level, I would come into this church, and Megan, who's sitting over there, my wife, I would often say, I walked in here literally, I visualized an empty vessel, and I would, after communion, kneel over there and find that it was filling back up, and what I needed to go back out there for bridge collapses, for mass shootings, for whatever, was basically that. I think probably the one I remember the most, actually, was when Paul Wellstone was killed, and I was devastated. Paul Wellstone had been hugely influential for me. For some reason, instead of sitting there, I was sitting there. And I remember I think this was over there maybe or something, but you were preaching, and I mean, Megan, you probably remember I was kind of inconsolable. And as Mariann was speaking, I was shaking, I remember. And she just started talking, and you said something like, you know, how important he was to all of us. You made some reference to he may have even been a mentor or something like that. And I don't know whether you were or not speaking to me, but it just sort of, a lot of the pain kind of went out of me. And I do think people, and I wrote about it in my book, that people need to understand that ministers and political leaders, if they choose to do it a certain way, internalize a lot of trauma. And I wound up having to do some therapy and still probably have to because I internalized so much. But I'm actually sitting next to the person who detoxified me the most. And I've told you that before, but people need to know.
He's also being very modest. I think the thing I noticed about RT during that period is how present you were. One of the things that I consistently saw in your leadership as mayor was you just showed up all the time. You mentioned the funeral. I don't know how many funerals you attended. I think you attended more funerals than I've presided at in your time. You showed up constantly, and with the bridge collapse, I mean, that was kind of a fraught moment because the governor was sort of doing his thing and you were doing yours, and it was Valenti. It was Tim Valenti, and so it was. I mean, it was. Everyone was on their best behavior. It was all good, but it was just this sense of like, okay, in moments like that, the differences really don't matter, right? They really don't matter. We didn't ask anyone who they voted for when they walked through the door, right? Because and then that was the nature of your leadership as mayor in that moment and others besides.
I remember being at St. Mark's speaking, and I mentioned something about God and faith, and the governor and his wife looked at each other quizzically like, oh my God, a Democrat believes in God. This is like really weird. Anyways, okay, all right.
Next question.
Thank you for that digression. It was wonderful. Go ahead.
Rick Steinman from St. Mark's in Minneapolis. I've already discovered, I checked it out of the library, but I've already discovered this will be part of my collection because I have found some of your stories already resonating with me.
Thank you.
20 years ago, you met Ernesto Medina and Ruth Anna Hook. And I'd be curious to know, and the answers might be revealed further on in the book, but how are they today? And have you visited George Floyd Square?
Oh my gosh, yes, many times. Of course, every time I come home. And the Medinas are they're fine. They're fine, right? They're fine. They're great. Yeah. So, thanks.
Have you lost a mic there?
Well, I was using the handheld, but I'm good.
Speak into Mariann's ear, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can have one of mine. This is really loud.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments?
Let's take two more, and then we'll
Yeah, then
we'll
we'll
have a
stop.
break, and you
Oh,
can
my
all
goodness, yes.
have at these bishops.
All right, thank you both. I'm David in Minneapolis. I actually go to St. Luke's and St. James.
We still love you.
Yeah, it's all right.
We especially love you.
I want to ask you, all three of you, if you're willing, and it will probably have to be a brief response, but I'm in anguish over where the nation is right now. And I feel deeply that we're walking into a storm. We have, I think it's not over dramatic to say, we have a neo-fascist leader with enormous popular support. And we know what he would do if he were elected again. And elements of that are right here in Minneapolis, right here in Minnesota. I was raised as a Catholic. I'm not proud of how the Catholic Church responded in Hitler's Germany. They were complicit. What is our public stance as an Episcopal Church in the politics of this time right now? We have to be, I think that word courage will be needed more than ever. So I'm sharing my anguish, but I'm also sharing my absolute commitment to walk into this storm within this spirit that you're carrying. So however you want to speak to that, but we have to acknowledge what's in front of us. It's real. Thanks.
Do you guys want to start, or should I?
All
All right, let me start and let them think for a second about the faith piece of it, okay? Every single thing that you feel, I feel. And there are moments of extraordinary anguish that I feel. That is part of the reality of this very difficult moment, and people who keep their mouth shut are complicit. There is also another reality of this moment. And the reality of this moment is that after a couple centuries of enormous of this country being unable to face its original sins, we have turned over the rock. We are raising a generation that is often disparaged, but instead has said we won't accept shoving racism, sexism, everything else under the rug. We're going to face it full square. When George Floyd was murdered, the shame of this community, tens of thousands of people marched in the streets for reform. And every single day, one barrier that's been allowed to stand after the other falls. We are looking at climate and all these other issues right now, and we need to face both realities. And the fact of the matter is, we need to also understand that it is possible to be a better place, and we will be. I was raised on American exceptionalism. We rightfully have looked in the eye and unpacked that, but we also have to recognize that we are on the brink of, I believe, something far greater, and that is only if we can accept the fact that we can see both realities at once. And the final point I want to make is that the smartest thing that has ever been said in at least politics, I believe, is the only thing to fear is fear itself. That if you take immigration, if you take any of those isms that I mentioned, they're all about this zero-sum game that somehow everyone else is taking a piece of the pie. We are baking a bigger, more inclusive pie if we can see it and if we can fight the negative thing that you see and if we can embrace the reality without being afraid of a future that is very different and I believe much better.
You know, I'm not sure I'm going to add much to that either, but what I would say is that there's no question, to your point, that one of the biggest threats that our nation faces in this moment is the resurgence of white Christian nationalism. And so everything that you're saying in terms of the threat is true and real, and even more than that, much of it is claiming the name of Jesus for support. We had our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, with us in Minnesota this last weekend at our convention, and one of the reasons he has become a global figure is because of his sermon at the royal wedding. You all may have heard that he preached at the royal wedding a few years ago. And the thing about his sermon at the royal wedding that I think captured the nation and beyond's imagination is that here you had a major Christian leader who was preaching nothing but love. And what captured everyone's imagination is how novel and unusual and surprising it was for a major Christian leader to be preaching nothing but love. And it's, thank God we have Michael Curry. But even more than that, I think what is our role was your question, I think, or part of your question. I don't have the grand solution for how we navigate these waters in front of us. But what I do know is that it is my job, and it's your job, and it's Mariann's job, and it's RT's job, and it's everybody else's job to do everything we can as a community of Jesus' followers to look like public love.
Wow.
And to be speaking and acting in every moment, whether we have little small areas of influence or really large areas of influence, to reclaim the name of Jesus for what Jesus really is, which is about the power of love, and about the power of love to do everything we've been talking about tonight. And the last thing I would say is I think Mariann's book gives us a lot of the framing that we need for walking forward together in these moments. None of us can do everything. But one of the recurrent themes through the book about what it means to be brave in difficult moments is to do the next faithful thing. What the quote that she had about there's a limit to what you can see with the headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. And the headlight that we have is the power of love. And so we're called to make the whole trip that way.
Wow. Yeah, I thank you both. Maybe the one piece I would add is something that I heard a peacemaker from the UN who dedicated his whole life to maintaining peace between the warring tribes of Rwanda. And when he thought he had finally accomplished what he had set out to do and was on his way home, heard about the massacres and the genocide that happened there. And he was in Pennsylvania at the time, although he's of African descent, but he immediately made plans to go back to Africa, to go back to Rwanda, and several people were saying to him, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm a Christian, and for Christians, hopelessness is not an option. And I think what he meant by that was, certainly that was a pretty hopeless situation, but that part of his role was not to succumb to what feels like hopelessness. And being hopeless or feeling cynical or despairing doesn't take a lot of energy, actually. It's the easiest thing in the world to be cynical, to be negative, to be hopeless in certain contexts. But to be a hopeful person, to be one who stays in the game, for those of us who are in our elder years, and I feel that way myself now, be the wind in the sails of rising generations and to allow them to see in us a willingness, a commitment to stay connected and engaged, but also not in the way. All of those things are what we can do. I don't know how any of this is going to turn out. It could all go very badly, or it could be great, but we don't get to know before we act. We have to do what we can see by the sights that God gives us. So just want to stay faithful for as long as we can in the ways that we can, doing all the good that we can, and try to live as if what we say in church is true.
Nice. Great. So first, could we really thank Bishop for being here? Thank you so much, Craig. And Mariann, welcome home. It's just great to have you home. I'll give you a hug. Great to have you. So come and get into the other room and get the book. I want to argue too. Awesome.